Hello everyone, thank you so much for attending this book launch for Gangs, Drugs and Youth Adversity from Robert McLean, Ross Duker and Chris Holligan. Bristol University Press has had the privilege of working with both Ross and Robert before on their previous books, including the award-winning Police Community Relations in Times of Crisis. We were so pleased when they came back to us with Chris for this project. Based on Ross's original fieldwork spanning over 10 years, this book explores the transitional experiences of some of the young men he's worked with, as well as the experiences of today's young people and the practitioners who work to support them. We're also joined by James Densley, another author of ours, who will be facilitating the discussion today. We'll put details of the book and the discount code in the chat, so watch out for those. And please put any questions that you have in the chat that James will direct to the panelists after they've spoken. I'll now hand over to the speakers. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to this exciting book launch for this book right here, Gangs, Drugs and Youth Adversity, by my colleagues Ross Duker, Robert McLean and Chris Holligan. How this is going to go down today is I'm going to invite our three authors to introduce themselves briefly and to give an opportunity to share some thanks that they might have for people who are on this call and who helped support this project. They'll then hand back to me, and I'm going to give a brief overview of the book and some of my observations of it. And then I'll have a series of questions that I'll direct to the authors to share about their findings in the book and some of the key contributions to the literature that they've made. After that, we'll have an opportunity to answer questions from the floor, if you will, or from the Zoom space that we are in today. So if you have questions, please do drop them in the chat, and I will do my best to direct them to the authors and make sure that they get answered. So by way of introduction, my name is James Densley. I'm a professor and the department chair of the School of Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice at Metropolitan State University, which is based in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is about 4,000 miles away from my colleagues, who are all based, of course, in Scotland. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them for some brief introductions. And I think we'll start with the lead author, which is Ross Duker. So Ross.
Well, thanks very much, James. So as James said, I'm Ross Duker. I'm Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of the West of Scotland. And for the last couple of decades, really, most of my research has been on gangs and looking at street gangs and violence, territorial issues, and gang intervention strategies as well. But before I go any further, I'd like to say a few words of thanks, if that's okay, James. First and foremost to my two co-authors, who have been absolutely amazing to work with. It's been a truly collaborative experience, and I think we've had lots of fun along the way, as well as working well together. And, you know, I have to say Robert and Chris's writing and insights and scholarship has really enriched this book. And it's been a pleasure to work with them again. I'd also like to thank Angela and Rebecca and all the team at Bristol University Press, who have provided enormous support, I have to say, that I have not actually, to the extent I've not experienced before in previous projects, from the day that we submitted the proposal right through to today. So that's been really appreciated. And just to thank you, James, for hosting this event and acting as discussant, but also for the excellent foreword you provided for the book, which really provides the perfect lead-in to its content. And just to my family as well for putting up with me, as always, my wife, Karen, my son, Alan, my mum, my sister, and also, as you know, you might see if you get the chance to read the book in the inside cover, I have dedicated this book to my late dad, Ian Duker, who would have been 87 yesterday, and who really passed on so many values, including the hard work ethic that has enabled me to get through this project, as with others. So I just wanted to see that first of all, James, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. With any project like that, it's a team effort, and we're always grateful for that support. So I think that's really important to put that out there. So from Ross to Robert McLean. Robert, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I think Ross really more or less took up all the thanks to be given. So I won't spend long thanking people other than, of course, my co-authors and James and a couple of other colleagues such as Simon Harden and that I've worked with before, who've really helped me come on leaps and bounds in my academic career. But yeah, my name's Robert McQueen, criminal justice lecturer at the University of the West of Scotland. My research is over the past, well, probably the past 10 years or so, since I really began my PhD, has really focused on organised crime, criminal trajectories, youth and gang violence, and more so in the recent years moved towards, yeah, well, really like drug harms and drug supply and so forth. So that's really my area of expertise, and I hope that's what the kind of expertise I brought to the book and to the project. So yeah, thanks for obviously bringing us on board, Ross, and yeah, that's myself. What about yourself, James?
Brilliant. Thanks, Robert. And then last but certainly not least, Chris Holligan. If you'd like to introduce yourself, please. Oh, Chris, I think you are still muted. The classic Zoom dilemma.
Yeah.
There we go.
Otherwise known as a Freudian slip, perhaps. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone. You've been fantastic people to work with at all levels. I've worked with Ross and Robert. We'll not say much about that collaboration, but always been fantastic. We visited youth clubs that were surrounded with bad wire and a mattress on the floor in Govan many years ago when we were both about age 20. My own background is at the moment I'm a professor of education at UWS. Before that, in the past, I've been a teacher. I've worked in communities. I've worked in what were called borstal schools for boys. Typically, they were excluded from schools. Very small classes, quite a violent culture. One day I stupidly tried to get everybody out on a jog, and that was the wrong decision. And I've taken an interest in the inside of prisons with Ross, Pullman Prison, written about the life of young prisoners, written about street violence, and used Elijah Anderson's concept code of the street for that. Got interested in actor network theory to theorize violence, and so on. And basically, I have an abiding interest in what you might call the underworld and the way people adapt to society who don't have formal qualifications on the whole. And it's a fascinating area, how human beings adapt to what they've been given in life.
Yeah, that's excellent, Chris. And I think those themes really jump off the page in this particular book. So that's a really nice lead in to our discussion of this new book. So if you are just joining us, because I know that a few people came in a few minutes late, we are here today to talk about this book from Bristol University Press, which is Gangs, Drugs and Youth Adversity. And what I'm going to do now to help frame the conversation is read a little bit of the foreword that I wrote for the book. So if you have the book, there's a foreword from me, and I'm going to read a little bit of it because I think it will help set the scene for the questions that come, particularly for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to engage with the book and are only sort of approaching this because you know the authors or you've read the title of it. So here we go. So I first met Ross Duker in 2015 at an international conference on youth outreach organized by the City University of Hong Kong. Ross and I were invited plenary speakers and spent our days and nights being ushered between presentations, meetings, dinners, and even a midnight outing on the streets to interview local gang members and observe social service providers in action. We had stunning vistas, gracious hosts, good food, and great conversation. But with the jet lag there's a 14-hour time difference between Minneapolis and Hong Kong, most of that week remains a blur. One moment of clarity from my trip overseas was Ross's plenary speech. In a talk titled Scottish Youth Gangs, Territoriality and Street Violence, Ross shared insights from a decade of working with young offenders. Two things stood out from this talk. First, Ross wasn't one of those esoteric armchair theorists who claim to have all the answers about gang members despite never asking them any questions. No, Ross was a true pracademic. He'd paid his dues as a school teacher and was using that real world knowledge and experience to inform his scholarship, using data-driven and practiced and policy-focused techniques. Second, Ross really cared about the lives of the people he researched. These weren't just his participants and his subjects, they were human beings with stories to tell. So this talk in Hong Kong was built on Ross's earlier book, a 2009 book called Gangs, Marginalized Youth and Social Capital, and then another book in 2011 called Policing Youth Violence, Transatlantic Connections. Now, I'd read both of these books, as most criminologists probably had, but it was only after hearing Ross speak and spending time with him that week that I truly came to appreciate them. So there we were, 6,000 miles away from home, and voices from the streets of Glasgow and West Scotland were finally resonating. I understood what made that great city of gangs different from other places, but also the same, how poverty, sectarianism, and violence had shaped the city's past and its present. Well, here we are now, and it's the future. And with gangs, drugs, and youth adversity, continuity and change, Ross returns to the people and places he went to before to discover what, if anything, has changed in the last decade. And in this endeavor, he is joined by Robert McLean and Chris Holligan, prolific scholars who, like Ross, are not afraid to get their hands dirty, and in collaboration with Ross have advanced the field considerably in recent years. The trio have learned that Glasgow and West Scotland are different now. By treating violence as a disease, the police and community partners have presided over a miraculous decline in knife crime and territorial fighting that has significantly improved young people's life chances and life expectancy. Add to this smartphones and social media, which have removed the street imperative, and a modern celebrity and consumer culture, which has redefined masculine distinction. And more youth today are choosing to look good over acting bad. Drugs are another big change. They're so abundant, accessible, and affordable that using and dealing them is now routine. For an entrepreneurial few, drugs are a route to riches, but for so many more, they are the road to ruin. The book captures both sides of this equation, with careful consideration given to the catastrophic social and emotional consequences of offending and addiction. Mental health and trauma are new themes examined here that help broaden the appeal of the book to just beyond criminologists. Now, of course, some things never change. Sectarian conflict between Protestants and Catholics is still hiding in plain sight, shaping community norms and expectations. Social exclusion and structural disadvantages are still creating conditions conducive to crime by constraining life choices and incentivizing self-destructive behaviors. Who you are and where you are from still contribute to intergenerational continuity and gang participation. However, it's the voices of the young people in this book that make even the old feel new again. Every chapter is fresh and the findings feel urgent. Now, ever since Frederick Thrasher's seminal work on gangs, the themes of continuity and change have been key to gang research, but they've typically been studied at the individual level, using longitudinal survey data, for instance. The study of continuity and change at the group level, at the gang level, or at the community level is really rare. That is the major contribution of this book. continuity and change is the key theme, but it's looked at that much greater structural level. That's what's important here. Those books Ross was talking about in Hong Kong nearly a decade ago, they are less now snapshots in time and more a sign of what was coming. So this is a revisit of an old stomping ground, but it's also a reimagining of the world of the gang in contemporary Scotland. It's that tension between continuity and change that's the heart of the book, but it's that steadfast commitment to actionable research anchored in lived experiences that it's its soul. And this is no surprise, because that is the Ross that I first met in Hong Kong and the Ross that I've worked with every year since. He's constant. So I tell him at the end, don't change. Okay, that's the forward to the book. Hopefully that's piqued your interest. It makes you want to maybe go out and buy it, read it, adopt it for a class. But let's actually hear from the authors and not just my interpretation of events. And so I want to start with you, Ross. If you could maybe just give us a little bit more background on the development of this particular research project, because it's all very well saying this is a book, but it's an empirical book. It's rooted in field work, and it's also a revisiting of an earlier project. So maybe just talk us through the process of writing a book like this and what that field work was like. And you are muted. We're getting good at that.
You would think I would have learned, but no. Yeah. Thanks very much, James. That was really, really, a lovely introduction for us today. And yeah, I mean, this book came about, I think, because, as you mentioned yourself, my 2009 Gangs, Marginalised Youth and Social Capital book had been based on the first project, really, that Chris and I were involved in Glasgow's housing schemes. Maybe around gathering all the data around about 2007, 2008. I see Jimmy Wilson is here from Fair Scotland, and he'll remember well the first group that I came out and worked with him was the Easterhouse Skinheads in the East End of Glasgow. And it was a real eye-opener, because I had actually gone out into the field to find out a bit about sectarianism and about football bigotry and all of that stuff that you alluded to. But actually what we found was at the forefront of the young people's minds was territorial issues. And gang culture and violence was pretty much out of control at that time in Glasgow. And following that work, I got the chance to go international, if you like. I had the privileged opportunity of getting funding to go, as you've alluded to places like Hong Kong, to Los Angeles, Cincinnati, South Florida, and also Denmark, and gathered insights on international perspectives on gangs and interventions that can prevent gang violence and rehabilitate young people, largely through spiritual interventions. And when I came back I had been on a Fulbright scholarship for 4 months in the US, and I decided, as well as bringing me home, I wanted to bring my gangs research back home. And at that point, it was a decade since the original work, and I thought, wouldn't it be really interesting to actually go out into those housing schemes again and find out what's happened in the interim period. And so that's how the book came about. Robert and I sat down and started talking about what we might do, and then Chris came in on it. And yeah, I mean, it started with going out and talking to practitioners, people that I had a lot of respect for, that I've kept in touch with, that have been at the forefront of the public health approach to violence reduction, that has put Glasgow on the map, really, as being the leader in many ways in the UK of being able to reduce gang violence by focusing on the root causes through the work of the Violence Reduction Unit, for instance, and various, youth community organisations that we name in the book. And my original idea was to talk to practitioners, do some initial interviews with them, and then try and revisit some of my participants from 12, 13 years ago. But that proved a lot more difficult than I'd anticipated, because going through the organisations to try and get access to these young people, we found some of them had lost touch with the young people. Some young people had moved away out of Glasgow or even Scotland. Others, unfortunately, were known to be in prison because they had gone on to reoffend. And in some cases, the organisations could make contact with them, but the young people just didn't want to revisit that part of their past. But we did manage to get a few of the original sample, but then added to that by going out and talking to practitioners who themselves had perhaps been involved with the young teams when they were younger, had grown up in these housing schemes, and were able to talk about continuity and change themselves. And then, of course, the really important part was talking to young people. And so getting access to children, adolescents and young people in the ages of 13 to 20, largely using those organisations as gatekeepers, and then through snowball sampling being able to get access to other young people who had been brought up in the schemes in Glasgow and the surrounding areas. And it was a really nostalgic trip for me, actually, to go back into these communities all these years later and to see how things had really moved on. The biggest challenge is always putting young people at ease and building trust. Getting to know them is something I've always said is really important. Hanging around with these young people, getting to know them. And Jimmy, has made a comment in the group chat there about, actually being a youth worker, which is what I've always tried to do, go out on the street work, go into the youth clubs. I don't quite know if I ever did get one of these fair hoodies, but one of these days I might. And just putting them at ease, and then, having conversations with them. Because the one thing is, if you catapult in and try and do interviews with them, they're not going to tell you anything because they're highly distrustful, because they've been let down so much. A lot of them have suffered from terrible trauma and have had a whole range of adverse childhood experiences. But maybe you want to bring in Robert and Chris to share their...
Yeah, I was going to say, related to that, Robert, and I know this sort of better than most in some ways, because Robert and I have collaborated on a number of projects ourselves over the years. But Robert, you also have a knack for getting access to really hard to reach individuals and getting them to open up and talk to you. I've witnessed this firsthand, so I know how good you are at this. But maybe sharing a little bit of that as well, Robert, because there is a chapter in the book that really deals with drug dealing networks and the evolution of kind of the drug economy. And I know that you had a pretty large hand in that chapter and getting access to some of the young people to talk to you. So can you maybe speak a little bit about that process of the data gathering for this work?
Yeah, thanks for putting us in the spot a wee bit there.
That's what we're here for, right?
Yeah, in terms of the young people, one thing I would actually say, and actually you had mentioned it earlier, James, in just this scene, I think it was Jimmy had put a comment about, Ross being able to really connect to young people, to children. Essentially, that's, I maybe don't always have the patience for that, but Ross really does. And I think having that kind of really caring for the young people, because some of the young people we spoke to in terms of with drug supply and that, particularly young, there was a young boy in the book, his story actually really touched me. And, Ross really made headway with the youth, being able to speak to them, getting them to open up and that. And I think that's something that's maybe quite unique to the kind of research that Ross does. So my own research tends to deal with people maybe like slightly older, maybe adolescents into adulthood, dealing with people involved in drug markets and so forth and organised crime. One of the things with it, put my foot in it, I'd always say is if my family and my extended kinship were police officers, of course I would have interviewed police officers, but they don't happen to be police officers. They maybe happen to belong to other networks and so forth. So having that kind of kudos, I think, helps a lot, being able to talk to people and understanding where people come from, because a lot of people paint the picture of, you know, young men that deal drugs or so forth, or consume drugs, as a black and white kind of picture, you know, particularly more for middle class arenas, whereby, you know, this is the good guys and this is the bad guys, and that's not really the case. You know, lots of people have found from the data, and even just, you know, for personal experiences, try to talk to people. Lots of people maybe get involved in this kind of world for different reasons. You know, we had young boys coming to the care system, as you know, and getting involved in drug supply and so forth, is a way to make a living. And that was probably, I think, one of the big changes that was seen for previous research when I've interviewed people involved in drug markets to the people that have been involved in the young people that have been involved in drug markets today, in terms of lots of them had actually seen it as perhaps a kind of career, you know, a way of making a living, a way of making their foothold in the world. And I think that's one of the big challenges that people face in society today. And it was something that really came across in the book. And it's something actually, like I says, I've got a boy myself, he's becoming an adult. And he's constantly faced with this image that, you know, if you maybe sell drugs or enter this world, that's a way to make a living. You know, it's a way to, you know, build an identity and so forth. And I think the big narrative that we're trying to bring out the book is that a lot of that is just, it's fake imaging, and it draws people into a world that they're maybe given a false impression of. I remember reading a book by Levin and Dubner many years ago in Freakonomics, and them mentioning that like 95% of people that sell drugs actually stay in their mum's house. You know, and why was that? What's that reason? Was because it's a false world, it's a false image, you know, it's all, and that's something that we continue to find again for the data in this book. Like I said, it was a really interesting experience going back with Ross over this, and like I said, I wasn't involved in the first book with Ross, but that kind of nostalgia, I think I was also able to tap into as I watched Ross kind of going place to place and speaking to people. And some of the stories, you know, it was good to see when you're reading a story, somebody's really did well in life. But unfortunately, some stories where people hadn't done well, you know, and that maybe sat. I remember transcribing one of the individuals giving their story, and I actually had to pause it for a minute, and I felt, this is terrible, you know, where this person has maybe ended up in life. And yeah, like I says, I was grateful for Ross bringing me on board, and I just try to add something a wee bit different to it by bringing that idea of drug markets, because it's something that impacts significantly, as we know for ourselves. James, we're researching on with Ross and Chris and Simon and that. You know, drug markets play a big part in the way that young people are brought up today, and the drug harms and so forth. So that's really when I was trying to contribute to the book, most notably. I don't know if that answers your question or.
No, I think that answered it very well. And I really appreciate the way you articulated this, you know, that you were quite moved at times by the narratives of these young people and the stories that they shared. And I think that comes across in the book, because there are throughout the book, which is, I think, quite a nice device that you've if you think of it as like a literary device, but there's like boxes in some chapters which just are dedicated to a longer, more in-depth analysis of somebody's story. So in addition to, you know, your standard kind of, you know, we interviewed somebody, here's the quote and here's the interpretation, you also just have these standalone boxes with stories in them, where you start to really feel like you kind of know these characters, if you will, they're real human beings, a little bit better, which I think was really powerful. Chris, I am not ignoring you. I'm going to come to you after the next question, which I'm going to direct to Ross. So I promise I am coming to you, Chris. And I think you'll have a lot to say about the question I ask you. So bear with me. But Ross, I think one thing I wanted to ask you before I go to Chris on the next one is this theme of continuity and change. It's literally the subheading of the book. And as I mentioned in my introduction, which is in the foreword to the book, that's an important theme in gang research in general. It's something, this idea of evolution in gangs is something that dates all the way back to Thrasher. And we've seen it in my own work. We've seen it in Robert McLean's work. I see Simon Harding is with us. Hi, Simon. It's in his work. You know, this is something that is really important, but it's so often it's studied on that individual level. So I think about colleagues like David Pyrus and others who've done great work on continuity and change on the individual level. This is unique in as much that you've tried to capture it more on that kind of structural community level, and then also tried to capture it more in terms of the group processes within gangs and the dynamics. So maybe talk a little bit more about those themes, because they're basically in every chapter.
Yeah, no, thanks, James. Yeah, I think that's what we hope is the unique selling point of the book, actually, and I think you identify that well, in as much as these kind of particularly qualitative studies of continuity and change at the group level, community level, are quite rare in criminology particularly. And so, yeah, I think what we've tried to capture is, in a general sense, how Glasgow and the wider west of Scotland has changed, evolved, and how some things have stayed the same. So, you know, generally speaking, what we found was that territorial issues that were so prominent in my first book have slowly declined over the last 10 to 15 years. And that's largely, it's because of a number of factors, changing young people's pastimes, the work of the youth and community organisations, but also things like, and the No Knives Better Lives project as well, which has been really important in reducing knife carrying, but also the work of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, which has been instrumental in really kind of giving out a different message, you know, that actually we can't go on jailing our way out of this problem, that actually we need to address the root causes. And those root causes are so often things like adverse childhood experiences, poverty, social inequality, trauma. And so as a result of an accumulation of all of these things, territoriality is much less prominent in Glasgow. Gang violence that we used to hear about day in, day out, it's very rare, you know, that we hear about a gang fight in Glasgow now. But having said that, there are some communities in the west of Scotland that still experience a disproportionate level of violence. And there are, what we found was, strong remnants of territorial issues still prevalent, you know, so things as simple as tagging associated with the young teams that still appear from time to time, antagonism between young people from different schemes that don't always lead to gang violence, but what they do lead on to sometimes is online antagonism through social media. And we still get spontaneous flashpoints on gang fights in some communities. And so I think you're right, you know, in many ways that reflects Thrasher's, you know, observations, you know, because often these gang fights are unplanned now. They're spontaneous, they're based on boredom sometimes, or just underlying issues of historical antagonism. And recently, of course, very sadly, in the East End of Glasgow, we had the murder of the 14-year-old boy, Justin Mclaughlin, who I know was very, very close to the staff and the young people associated with Fair Scotland. So, you know, that illustrates, and it was part of a recent spate of gang violence that re-emerged in the East End of Glasgow. So it illustrates that this problem has not gone away. But gang evolution has definitely taken place, and Robert will maybe speak more about this later, where we do have more focus on drug distribution networks at a much earlier age. And we have, as you mentioned yourself, this emphasis on looks and about image, building a digital self as well as a physical self. And that leads to its own issues, but the root causes are still the same. It's poverty and it's social inequality. And as you said yourself, we found there's still this presence in Glasgow of football-related bigotry. Now, of course, we could discuss all day whether or not it actually represents sectarianism. I know that Chris's work has challenged that, and perhaps, you know, we've seen the breakdown of what we might regard as sectarianism in the past, you know, because of inter-religious marriage, because of the increasing secularization in Scottish society. But the old firm fixture is still very much the thing that stimulates a lot of this bigotry, and also the marches and parades that we still see in Scotland, loyalist and Republican marches. And, you know, reflecting Hamilton Smith's work recently, what we found was it's often the bystanders and the counter demonstrations that create some of the issues. But lots of young people still have an interest in this and a presence at these marches. And social media is the big change that we found. I mean, probably when I was doing the original work, I think we were just seeing the emergence of things like Bebo at that time. Well, we've moved a long way on from there. And we now have the advent of Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, WhatsApp, and these encrypted apps where it's, you know, drugs are it's easier to order drugs than it is to get a pizza in many ways now. And we've got, what we found was young people self-medicating on cannabis, particularly for symptoms of stress and anxiety. You know, getting involved in what we might describe as a skeleton form of county lines that we see in Scotland. I'm sure Robert will speak more to this later. And generally the presence of capitalism, neoliberal ideology that has led to this consumerism culture where, you know, selling drugs is often the only means that the young people have to be able to address the symptoms of poverty and social inequality. And of course, debt bondage plays a really big part in that, you know, where they're consuming drugs themselves, they're getting drugs on tick, and so they're then having to sell drugs to fund their own habit as well. So we saw quite a lot of things that have remained the same, but also things that have emerged and re-emerged in some cases as well.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate some of those points actually, Ross, which will lead into my next question, which will go to Chris, which is to say, you know, if you just take a little step back, you know, for the listeners and viewers here on Zoom, you just outlined in 5 minutes that this is a book that touches on, you know, the old firm, Derby, you know, Rangers, Celtic, sectarianism, violence. It touches on the role of social media in the lives of young people. It touches on the role of, you know, disadvantage and exclusion from conventional economic systems, and how that then feeds into participation in the drug economy. You talked about the declining of territoriality, but still the bubbling up of tensions and violence, often because of social media, and the need to construct this self-image. So just a long way of saying, you know, there's a lot in this book. There's a lot in this book that covers a number of really important themes that I think are very timely, and that many criminologists, but also the general public, are grappling to kind of understand. And here's my segue to the question, Chris. This is also a book, because of all those reasons, that is especially timely for practitioners and policymakers. And the final chapters of the book really try and speak to those audiences directly, with implications for policy and for practice, but also for future research as well. I mean, Chris, I didn't know if you wanted to speak a little bit about what you see as being the key policy and practice implications of this work, as we go forward. It looks like you have a long list, so I will shut up and let you get on with it.
It's not a list, it's a lesson plan, James.
Well, I think we've got some time. You're good. Go for it.
What, the aims and objectives first or straight into the content?
I would go straight content.
Yeah. Well, it's quite interesting that I'll speak quite quickly, okay? It's quite interesting you mentioned continuity and change, because that is a theme. Did you know that the Cambridge University Press journal, there is one called Continuity and Change, a journal of social structure, law, and demography in past societies. So there you go. Lots of connections. It's a particular historical premise, really. History looks at continuity and change. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to talk about quickly before I go on to policy directly is the role of the law in terms of class structure, and what Marxist sociologists say about the law is biased towards working class and unemployed communities. For example, we see evidence of that in terms of no one's went to prison connected with the banking crisis. No one's went to prison in connection with dodgy contracts connected with COVID. So there is clearly a middle and upper middle class bias against criminalizing these parts of the class structure. So I think this is one of the reasons why we see continuity with the parts of class structure we're looking at, because the criminal law remains constant in its focus on that demography. So the policy notes I've made are particularly difficult for policy to capture, if we're speaking about, say, Scottish Government policy, to capture the speed and nature of changes in criminality and marginality. Marginalisation is different from criminality, but the two are connected. So if there's going to be an intervention about marginality, it ought to impact on criminality. Quite often we talk about social exclusion and inclusion, but going back to what Robert was saying, and that connects up with what I've said about the class structure, is that these are individuals in a sense who've become criminalised as they make their way through life, because their employability declines each time the criminal record gets stronger. And in the UK, having a criminal record, unlike in some countries, it can last for a lifetime. So to find a group apart from, say, in Timpson's the shoe shop and some other places, it's quite hard to get a job once you've got a criminal record, especially if it's got anything about violence or prison in it. So policy also has got implications in terms of how do you intervene in areas of intergenerational disadvantage? And is policy framed around gangs? I don't particularly think so, although it's a violence reduction unit, it doesn't mention gangs as such. Around violence, around illegal drugs. I think policymakers are scared of these things because policymakers are also dealing with the reputation of a country, and they want to frame the country in a particular way so that the economy doesn't suffer because tourists stop coming because the place is full of gangs and violence and illegal drugs. So I think there's a public portrayal of a national economy. Hope you're nodding, Ross, in terms of these areas. So the policy, although it will touch often on these things, it will not necessarily foreground them because of a macro picture they have. I think one thing that's not been mentioned so far, and that's the policy on schooling and school exclusion, because you tend to find that most of the kids, if I could call them like that take this, you could say, negative future, has been excluded from school and found schools really hard places to be. And there's not enough policy, you might say, around supporting the mental health it develops, often through quite serious conflicts within the family settings. The policy challenge would also connect with a criminological environment. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's a rather sad example, but it should also make you laugh. I hope it doesn't define my masculinity. I had a Honda 125 stolen a couple of years ago. Yes, it was a Honda 125. I loved it very much. It was new. It was found in an area that Ross has maybe visited in Edinburgh. Don't let anybody think Edinburgh doesn't have its areas, postcodes that are like Glasgow and other places. It does. And it was found covered in grass in a park in this area of Edinburgh, kicked to pieces. Even though it was a new bike, there had been frustration at not being able to fill it up with petrol because there was cameras at the petrol station. So it was decided just to destroy it. It broke my heart to see it in that position, but nevertheless, that just testifies to my materialist values. However, when I went to pick it up, there was people standing in the doorways smoking a fag, and I'm talking about people in demography we would call grannies and grandpas, just looking nonchalantly. They knew who had nicked the bike. They knew who had kicked it to pieces. But they just stood there watching the cops pick up the bike and so on and so on. There wasn't any empathy or caring. So you're dealing with a kind of sedimented kind of us and them culture to some extent. You know, and when you've got that built over generations in certain areas, that takes you into the trust issue, of course. Something that's not been mentioned so far is youth culture. Distinguishing between youth culture and gang culture is quite difficult, but they do interact. Robert has spoken to me before about youth gangs, territorial gangs, or youth culture being a recruiting ground for organised crime. I mean, they've got to get the recruits from somewhere. So that idea of the drift, the networking is a fascinating area, moving from being like 16 or 17 to being used for carrying drugs and so on, which of course is quite a big practice in the south of Italy. The idea of the public health approach to violence, I mean, I don't critique it. I'd have to think more about it, but I don't know if it's conceptually coherent to say there's a public health approach to violence, just like we have the public health approach to lung cancer. It seems to me there's something different about these phenomena. To think that you can have a public health approach to violence and criminality when its seeds are sown, for example, by having a criminal record, it doesn't seem to me to be something you can do an operation on, because somebody with a criminal record is going to find their life is really hard to get any employment and therefore get a decent house, get a mortgage and so on. So the public health approach, I would say it maybe needs to be more precise. I find it a little bit vague, and I don't know how well it's been monitored. Some people in this area, I'll close now, talk about lifestyles. I think that's maybe a mischaracterization. I think the best way to characterize what I've seen and what I feel about these areas and about boys in prison of this age group is that they've been given opportunities that are the opportunities that are available to them within their networks and in their communities. Other opportunities are less available, are harder to access, and they've used their intelligence to deal with the opportunities that are available on their doorstep. And if they happen to involve drug dealing and violence, that becomes their form of capital to navigate and have a lifestyle. So it's not so much a lifestyle of choice, it's a lifestyle of availability. There you go.
No, that's great. Thank you. I think what you've also spoken to here, I mean, you started all the way with kind of Marxist theory,
I did.
all the way through to opportunity structures and sort of classical criminological theory there. And I think it speaks to this idea that we have to understand policy and practice in that broader context. And there is theory that drives a lot of the recommendations at the heart of the book. The idea also around the public health model being, successful in as much that it's reducing violence, but also perhaps somewhat nebulous in the public discourse, I think is also really important as well, because now you hear the term public health thrown around all over the place, but at times it's sort of ill-defined and we're not quite sure what we're referring to. Well, I'm looking at the clock and we have about 10 minutes left, which is, I guess, time for what I might call the quickfire round, which is to say that we've got some questions from the audience that I think we should engage with in our time left together. I noticed, Ross, that you had responded to Andy Wilson, who had written in the chat, "I am a first-year PhD student and recently retired Scottish police officer. Are the findings of the book replicable in other Scottish cities?" I noticed you'd given a written response. I just wanted to sort of add there, there is a replication crisis in social science in general. This is something that is particularly difficult in qualitative research because of all the nuances that make qualitative work so rich, also make it really hard to generalize from. And I think that was what you spoke to in your answers. Am I capturing that correctly, Ross?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, that we never set out in qualitative research to try and gain insights that are going to be replicable and generalized beyond the sample and the context where we're working. So I would say this book is about the west of Scotland. It's not just Glasgow, because we did visit a number of other towns in the surrounding area of the west of Scotland. But I think, it's principally the insights are, but I would conjecture that the insights about drugs would, I suspect, be applicable to lots and lots of different parts of Scotland, the UK and beyond. But I would see some of the other themes. Yeah, the whole issue of drug distribution and, the consumption of drugs, the selling of drugs and how easily accessible they are now.
I think it's important tied to the macro issues of the book, right? It's a global drug economy and it's global capitalism, and so those themes are sort of universal, but we see microcosms of them in the different communities that they operate in. So
we do, and I think social media is the same, and the impact and the mental health epidemic, which is also a global problem, I think. But I think there are other themes that are particularly unique to Glasgow and its surrounding communities, perhaps. Things like the football bigotry, which spills over into other parts of Scotland, but it's probably not as prevalent as it is in Glasgow. And
Glasgow's history with deindustrialization and other factors, which, perhaps are not as pronounced in other communities as well. Robert, I want to come back to you for a quick question, which is to say, a question we have here about COVID-19. I know that you pretty much wrapped up the fieldwork to this book just before the pandemic shut everything down, which was pretty opportune timing. But do you have a sense of how COVID-19 might be having an impact on some of these issues, particularly around the drug networks, social media, some of the other things that you discussed earlier?
I should probably prepare beforehand. Nah, get on.
That one came from the floor, so there's no preparation available. Yeah,
we did have some. I mean, some of the interviews did take place after, when the lockdown had occurred, and finding new ways to do research and do interviews was probably the most challenging aspect of that, particularly when you're talking about things like drug dealing, because lots of people maybe don't want to reveal really what's happening. They might speak to you one-on-one and you can transcribe, but then when you start to speak to people online, you're recording, they can see themselves being recorded, or you maybe like using certain types of apps on the mobile to record and conduct interviews. It can be very difficult. So there was issues in terms of recording data, but you were right that most of what we did had already been done before COVID, so that was quite lucky there. But it did help us also think about, how are we really going to develop and how we do research going forward, which is something that's actually helped us with our own students, like dissertation students, PhD students and that, so maybe we bring that kind of information to them. Regarding drug supply with COVID, I think that obviously it depends. I'm trying to word this carefully, but because obviously I'm not want to offend people or anything. But I know that from my own kind of circles during the COVID outbreak, I didn't actually really. I know people taken very ill with COVID, of course. I didn't know anyone directly that had passed away from COVID, but I do know 4 people who I know you personally, or within my age group, slightly younger, who did pass away for drug overdoses during that period in time. And I think that was a real issue. I mean, it was really a real devastating issue, particularly when maybe young dads and young mums were passing away, and the impact that had upon wider family, children that were still very young, being brought up. There was a lot of issues in terms of, we found with COVID, mental health, and the mental health with the abuse of certain drugs probably went hand in hand, I would say, and there was a real issue with obviously the sale of fake Valium, they're called, whereby people start to produce Valium in their own homes, homemade chemists and producing Valium that's then sold. I think that was probably the main thing that we've seen, and that's, you see that in the drug harms and drug death rates across the country as well, so that is something that is more generalisable, and I think that's probably touched everybody. People have noticed the real impact, particularly on younger generations, with drug abuse, volley drug use during the COVID period. In terms of supply itself, I think that obviously there's been a considerable advancement, because research has shown that when generally criminals in any type of organised or business type criminality, when tension is applied, they tend to evolve their responses very fast, and it's helped a lot of people have probably learned to connect with drug dealing through social media in terms of supply. That's probably been the biggest thing, because they've been forced to. So you have seen a rise in terms of how people have distributed drugs, and that's probably something that's going to continue, using certain groups, certain chats, and that. We've seen that, of course, with the police breaking and the Engro chat quite recently and so forth. So the real issue, I would say, with COVID and drugs, though, has been the drug use amongst younger generations during the pandemic.
Excellent. And I think we have time for one last question, which comes from Simon Harding on the chat. He talks about how Glasgow historically was always defined by a more quote unquote recreational gang violence, that sort of territoriality that you talked about earlier. Whereas a lot of the themes we've been discussing today, the rise of drug markets, social media, and so on, seem like Glasgow might be moving toward a gang model, if you will, or a youth violence model that looks a little bit more like cities like London, for instance. Any thoughts about that comparative perspective on this? And again, we're running very short on time, so just a brief response to that one, and then we'll wrap it up here. But this idea of, is global market forces, how I frame it this way, are global market forces, the internet, capitalism, drug distribution networks, and so on, are they helping to converge youth experiences and gangs? And is that something that I think the book speaks to? Maybe Ross, if you want to tackle that one.
Yeah, I'll go first. I think Simon's absolutely right. I think we are seeing a change in Glasgow, and it's because of what you've said there. I think these global influences, social media and so on, and the influence of, young people spend a huge amount of their time now online and on social media, and so they're connecting with people from any part of the world at any time. And so inevitably there are global influences. So I think we're maybe seeing less of the very kind of particular Glasgow type recreational violence that we used to see and more of the global drug influences and capitalism influences. So I would say that's absolutely right. And interestingly, although we didn't have enough evidence in the book, but we did for a couple of the young people we noted were using London type terminology as well. They were talking about olders and youngers, so it was almost like tartanized a wee bit. Instead of elders and youngers, it was olders and youngers. And so on. But I think we would need a lot more research to be able to see just explore how widespread those kind of influences are. Maybe Robert or Chris want to add to that.
Well, I think I would love them to do so, but I think we are out of time for today's presentation, which really just leads me to say, buy the book. Because everything we've talked about here today is covered in this book, Gangs, Drugs and Youth Adversity, Continuity and Change. As you can see, really important themes throughout that work. I see a question already just popped up in the chat for Stuart Piper had mentioned around this idea about vulnerability and criminalization of certain populations. These are all themes that are also raised in the book and are discussed. And so I would highly recommend you check it out. I want to send my thanks to Bristol University Press, Andrew, for being here and helping facilitate this today. And then, of course, to Ross Duker, Robert Mcqueen, and Chris Holligan. Thank you for writing this book and for being here for this discussion today. And thanks to all the attendees that joined us, and anyone who can watch this when it gets posted online. My understanding is that this video has been recorded, and so what you say can and will be held against you as evidence, and there'll be an opportunity for you to watch this back in the future. So again, to Ross, Robert, and Chris, thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. Go get it. Here's the book. I've got it. You should get it too.
We'll read your commission later, James.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, James. He isn't on retainer for BUP, but I think he probably should be. Thank you, James, and also to Ross, Robert, and Chris for your contributions today. It's a really fascinating discussion, and it's a timely topic and one that's clearly evolving all the time. So details of how to order the book at that half price are in the chat, as James has mentioned. I'll send a link to you in the next few days, and also to the recording, which you can drop back into anytime you like. Do share it with any colleagues who couldn't make it today. Thanks again to all our panelists and everyone who attended today. And I hope to see you at a future BUP webinar very soon.